On the evening of June 12, 2019, Sarah Whitaker and her 7-year-old daughter Lucy pulled into the Bliss Rest area off Interstate 84 in Idaho, about 2.5 hours into what should have been a routine 5-hour drive. The trip was supposed to be a reset, a quiet night in a cheap roadside motel before finishing the journey to Spokane the next day. Sarah, 35, had just wrapped up a grueling custody hearing with her ex-husband in Boise that afternoon. According to her sister Andrea, the courtroom battle had left her emotionally drained, but determined. She had gained partial custody of Lucy for the summer, a small victory in a much larger war she had been fighting for the past 3 years. Greg, her ex, lived in Spokane and had fought tooth and nail to limit her access to Lucy. Friends said Sarah often felt watched in the weeks leading up to the hearing, but her claims were vague, no hard evidence, just a growing sense of unease. Her sister chalked it up to stress. No one imagined those fears would escalate into something this dark. At 7:42 p.m., the Subaru Outback was captured on highway surveillance pulling into the rest stop. The rest area, a remote patch of pavement surrounded by scrubland and cottonwood trees, had no gas station or restaurant. Just 2 picnic tables, a set of vending machines, and a public restroom structure with flickering overhead lights. Sarah had stopped for gas earlier in Mountain Home around 6:30 p.m. Her debit card records showed a $42.87 charge at a Chevron station. Cell tower data later confirmed that both her and Lucy's phones were active until 7:49 p.m. Then they went dark. There were no outgoing calls or texts, no emergency alerts, just silence. Rest stop security footage, captured by 2 aging dome cameras mounted to the restroom roof, showed Sarah and Lucy exiting the vehicle at 7:44 p.m. Sarah, in jeans and a navy hoodie, popped the trunk to retrieve a jacket for Lucy, who trailed behind her holding a half-eaten granola bar. They walked to the restroom side by side. No one else was visible. At 7:51 p.m., the cameras showed them returning to the vehicle. Sarah stopped briefly to buy a soda from the vending machine. Lucy skipped in a small circle while waiting. Sarah handed her the bottle and opened the driver's side door. Then the footage ended. Or more accurately, it kept recording, but they never reappeared. They didn't re-enter the building. They didn't pull out of the lot. The car remained parked in the same spot for the rest of the night. No one noticed anything strange. By 10:15 p.m., Andrea started texting. No response. That wasn't like Sarah. She was always quick to check in, especially after traveling. By 11:30, Andrea was calling, repeatedly. At 1:06 a.m., Sarah's phone stopped ringing and went straight to voicemail. At 7:22 a.m., Andrea called Boise PD. They informed her that jurisdiction issues meant she needed to contact Idaho State Police, who then pinged Sarah's phone and discovered her last known location, the Bliss Rest area. At 9:43 a.m., a state trooper pulled into the lot and immediately spotted the silver Subaru. The car was unlocked. Sarah's purse sat on the passenger seat. Her wallet, keys, and phone were all inside. Lucy's pink rabbit plush was buckled into the back seat, right where she'd placed it after their last stop. The vending machine soda, a Dr. Pepper, still sat in the center console, unopened. There was no sign of struggle, no broken glass, no blood, no drag marks in the gravel. It was as if the mother and daughter had stepped into thin air. The trooper requested backup. By noon, the area was taped off. A K-9 unit arrived from Twin Falls. Cadaver dogs swept the woods in the perimeter. Helicopters were dispatched. Nothing. No heat signatures, no clothing, no indication anyone had wandered into the surrounding terrain. And yet, there was no sign of where they could have gone. The nearest buildings were several miles away. The only road in or out was the interstate. No witnesses came forward. No other cars had been reported lingering in the lot during that window. One trucker who passed through at 8:05 p.m. said he didn't even realize another vehicle had been parked nearby. Detectives considered whether Sarah could have staged her disappearance, but her wallet and keys were left behind. There was no financial activity on her accounts after 7:30 p.m. Her phone was turned off, not destroyed. It still powered on when examined, with a battery at 68%. No outbound calls had been made after leaving Mountain Home. The last photo on her phone was a blurry picture of Lucy holding up a rock in the rest stop parking lot, time-stamped 7:47 p.m. By that evening, missing persons flyers were being distributed along Interstate 84. Sarah and Lucy's photos began circulating on Facebook and local news stations. Andrea made a tearful plea on television, asking anyone who had seen a white van or a person acting strangely to call in. It was the first time many in the country heard about the vanishing, a mother and daughter gone without a trace in the middle of nowhere. As the hours turned to days, search crews began expanding the radius, but nothing turned up. No scent trails, no tire tracks out of place, no surveillance footage from other rest areas showing their car or any other vehicle linked to their disappearance. It was as if the rest stop itself had swallowed them whole. And as investigators dug deeper, one question became impossible to ignore. If Sarah and Lucy didn't leave in that car, who took them and how? By 7 a.m. the next morning, Sarah Whitaker's phone was still going straight to voicemail. Her sister, Andrea, had barely slept, pacing her apartment in Spokane as she refreshed her messages again and again, waiting for something, a text, a call, anything. The last time they spoke was just before Sarah left Boise, sometime around 5:30 p.m. the previous day. Andrea had expected an update later that evening once Sarah and Lucy checked into the motel in Jerome. Instead, there had been silence. At first, she thought maybe they'd fallen asleep early. Maybe Sarah's phone had died. But by dawn, the worry turned to dread. She started calling area motels. No one by that name had checked in. She tried local hospitals. Nothing. By 8:30, Andrea was dialing Boise police, who directed her to the jurisdiction Sarah would have passed through. Eventually, she was connected to the Idaho State Police. A trooper was dispatched to drive the corridor between Boise and Jerome, focusing on rest stops, gas stations, and roadside pull-offs. He found Sarah's Subaru at 10:41 a.m., parked near the tree line of the Bliss Rest area. The car wasn't hidden. It wasn't covered or moved off-road. It sat in the open like dozens of others that pass through the interstate every day. But what stood out was what hadn't been taken. The driver's side door was unlocked. Inside, Sarah's purse was on the front passenger seat. Her wallet was zipped, phone tucked beneath it, still holding a charge but powered off. Her keys were missing. Lucy's small pink backpack lay in the rear seat next to her beloved stuffed rabbit, the same one she'd been seen holding on security footage just hours before. The soda Sarah had bought from the vending machine, still sealed, sat in the cup holder. It looked like the vehicle of someone who had stepped away briefly. But no one had returned. The trooper radioed the find in. A missing persons report was officially opened, and within the hour, Twin Falls County Sheriff's Office took over primary jurisdiction. Deputies arrived on the scene and began photographing and cataloging every detail inside and around the car. There was no evidence of forced entry, no blood, no broken glass, and no visible struggle. The seats were upright. The floor was clean. A small pile of receipts was found in the center console. Fast food in Boise, gas in Mountain Home. Nothing unusual. What disturbed the investigators more than what they found was what they didn't. There was no indication of where Sarah or Lucy had gone, or why. Surveillance footage from the rest stop's outdated camera system was reviewed. It showed Sarah pulling in just before 7:45 p.m., exiting the vehicle with Lucy. They were seen walking toward the restrooms, Lucy clutching her hoodie and Sarah holding her phone. At 7:51 p.m., they returned. Sarah used the vending machine while Lucy spun slowly in the gravel, humming or talking to herself. They walked back to the Subaru. Sarah unlocked the car. Lucy got into the back seat. Sarah opened the front door. And then the camera kept recording. But no one left. No one entered the restrooms after them. No other vehicle pulled in for the next 45 minutes. The lot remained lit by a dim yellow floodlight. From that point on, the car never moved again. It simply sat there, untouched, abandoned, unchanged. Authorities pulled nearby traffic cams and requested dash cam footage from truckers who passed that stretch of I-84 that night. A few provided footage, but it was inconclusive. One trucker's dashcam at 8:13 p.m. captured a glimpse of the rest area. The Subaru was there. No other vehicles were visible, no lights, no figures, no motion. By 8:45, another passing driver noticed the rest stop empty, save for a lone vehicle under the lights. It had to be Sarah's. That narrowed the window. If something had happened, it likely occurred between 7:51 p.m. and 8:30 p.m., a span of less than 40 minutes. Yet no one reported screams, no signs of alarm, and no one, not a single driver, saw anyone walking along the highway or emerging from the woods. That afternoon, state police cordoned off the rest area with yellow tape. Forensics swept the vehicle, gathering trace evidence. They found fingerprints, Sarah's and Lucy's, but no foreign prints on the handles, seats, or trunk. No hair or fibers that didn't belong. It was like a sealed room mystery in the open air. Dogs were brought in to track a scent trail, and at first, handlers believed they had something. A lead dog caught Lucy's scent briefly, moving toward the edge of the tree line. But then, it stopped. No continuation, no discarded item, no footprint, nothing. A second dog attempted the same route, same result, scent, then sudden loss. Volunteers began arriving as word spread. Locals joined the search, forming lines and walking the surrounding acreage in grid formation. Helicopters flew overhead. Drones with thermal cameras scanned the terrain. Detectives interviewed people at nearby gas stations and diners, asking if anyone had seen a woman and child the night before. They hadn't. Sarah hadn't used her debit card since the gas stop in Mountain Home. Her phone had sent its final signal just after 7:49 p.m., pinging a tower 1.2 miles east. Then it went dead. Lucy's tablet, usually in her backpack, wasn't recovered. Investigators weren't sure if it had been taken or simply left behind elsewhere. The media picked up the story that evening. A mother and daughter gone without a trace from a rest stop in daylight. It didn't fit any obvious narrative. There was no sign of foul play, but also no suggestion they had left voluntarily. Nothing pointed to a planned disappearance. Everything Sarah needed, ID, money, keys, had been left behind. That night, Andrea stood outside her apartment, holding back tears as she spoke to a local news crew. She said Sarah was responsible, cautious, and deeply devoted to Lucy. She would never leave that child behind, she said, and if she's gone, something terrible happened. Investigators had no theory to refute it. All they had was a timeline, a parked car, and two names now listed in a growing national database of the missing. The only question left was how they disappeared from a place designed for temporary stops, without anyone seeing how. Within days of Sarah and Lucy's disappearance, suspicion quietly began to shift in a familiar direction. Greg Whitaker, Sarah's ex-husband and Lucy's father, was contacted by investigators 3 days after the Bliss Rest Area incident. Officially, it was a routine inquiry, nothing more than protocol. But off the record, Greg had already been flagged. In the months leading up to the court hearing in Boise, Greg's behavior had grown increasingly volatile. He was known to lose his temper during custody exchanges, sometimes yelling loud enough that daycare staff would intervene. At the final court appearance, just 48 hours before Sarah vanished, witnesses described Greg as visibly furious. One clerk recalled how his fists remained clenched throughout the proceedings. He left the courthouse red-faced, storming past Sarah without a word, refusing to make eye contact. To Andrea, it was obvious that he had taken the outcome personally, too personally. When she brought this up to investigators, they listened. Greg told police he'd been attending a work conference in Pullman, Washington, the night Sarah went missing. He provided the name of the hotel, a check-in time, and the name of a project supervisor who could vouch for him. On the surface, it looked like a solid alibi. But when detectives followed up, cracks started to appear. The hotel confirmed that Greg had checked in, but not until 10:53 p.m., nearly 3 hours after Sarah was last seen on camera. The manager on duty recalled Greg arriving alone, irritable, and asking whether the bar was still open. There was no proof of where he had been prior to that. The conference itself didn't start until the following morning. His supervisor said he hadn't seen Greg that entire evening, and assumed he was arriving late by choice. Greg's drive from Boise to Pullman could have taken 6 hours, but only if he'd left directly after court. It was a long route, winding through small towns and dark highways, one that passed suspiciously close to I-84. When asked about the timeline, Greg said he'd driven straight through and stopped only once for gas in La Grande, Oregon. Detectives pulled security footage from the station he named. No sight of him, no debit card transaction in his name. Nothing to verify the stop ever occurred. When confronted, Greg grew defensive, claiming he must have paid in cash, though he rarely did. He blamed the inconsistencies on stress. He didn't remember the drive clearly, he said. He just wanted to get away from everything. But the timeline was tight, and his story kept shifting. Meanwhile, Andrea told investigators something she hadn't previously shared. A week before the court date, Sarah had told her she felt like someone was following her. It had started small, a car she saw twice in one day, headlights in the mirror too long at night, noises outside her apartment window. She never provided a license plate, never called the police, and never even described the vehicle. Andrea pressed her, but Sarah brushed it off. She didn't want to sound paranoid. But Andrea had heard something else in her voice, fear, cloaked in that forced, matter-of-fact tone Sarah always used when trying not to panic. It wasn't like her to be vague. She was always the one making plans, locking up tight, and double-checking her steps. For her to feel unsafe and not act on it, that was telling. Andrea relayed all this to detectives, her voice shaking as she did. She wanted to believe her sister had just needed a break, but deep down, she couldn't stop thinking that Sarah had seen something coming, and no one had listened. The investigation turned toward the highway. State police began pulling traffic reports and reviewing additional dashcam submissions. A tip came in from a long-haul trucker who said he'd seen a white cargo van parked just off the ramp near the Bliss Rest area sometime between 7:30 and 8 p.m. the night Sarah vanished. He didn't remember anything specific, just that it looked odd, unmarked, and facing the opposite direction of traffic. Investigators seized on the lead. They put out a bulletin asking for information on any white utility vans traveling through the area that night. Surveillance footage from traffic cameras up to 10 miles away was reviewed, and several white vans were flagged. One belonged to a plumbing company in Twin Falls, another to a bakery distributor. All were accounted for. None had been near Bliss. The trucker was re-interviewed. His description became fuzzier with each retelling. Eventually, he admitted he wasn't even sure it was that night. He had made that drive 3 times that week. The tip was filed away, no longer actionable. As days turned into weeks, the leads thinned. Greg was never named a suspect publicly, but the tension around his involvement lingered. He stopped cooperating with police after their second interview, citing legal counsel. When asked if he would take a polygraph, he refused. His official statement was that he hoped Sarah and Lucy would be found safely. But to Andrea, his silence was louder than any words. She believed he knew more than he was saying. Investigators weren't ready to make that leap. There was no physical evidence tying him to the scene, no witness placing him in the area, and no forensic trail to follow. But as one detective later said, the absence of evidence wasn't proof of innocence. It just meant that whoever had done this, if someone had, knew how to leave nothing behind. And somewhere between the false starts and closed doors, the case began slipping into something colder, something heavier. The kind of mystery where the facts feel thinner each day, and where the people left behind begin asking whether the truth was ever meant to be found at all. As the days dragged on with no trace of Sarah or Lucy, the official investigation grew more desperate. Detectives and search teams expanded their radius outward from the Bliss Rest area, turning their attention to the dense woodland that stretched behind the lot like a jagged green wall. At first glance, it seemed unlikely that a mother and child would willingly enter terrain so dense and uneven, especially near dusk. But when logic failed, they chased anything that remained. The trees were unpredictable, thick with brambles and downed branches, weaving around shallow creeks and sudden depressions that swallowed footprints and scattered scent. Still, they combed every inch. Local fire crews volunteered, game wardens lent their expertise, even prison inmate work crews were brought in under supervision to help clear brush and carry equipment. The ground was searched in precise grid lines, mapped by GPS, logged hourly, and flagged for anything unusual. Dozens of people moved in silence through the trees, calling Sarah's name, then Lucy's, then neither, just listening. 3 days into the forest sweep, a volunteer team flagged something near a moss-covered stump just beyond the search perimeter. It was a piece of pink fabric, tangled and half buried in the damp soil. A child's shirt fragment, they thought. Maybe a pajama top. The group held their breath as law enforcement secured the area. The fabric was bagged, cataloged, and rushed to the state crime lab. Everyone hoped it would break the case open. But 48 hours later, the results came back. It didn't belong to Lucy. The DNA profile was traced to an unrelated case from 3 years earlier, involving a missing child who had already been found and reunited with her family. The fragment had likely been discarded or transported by weather. It was a cruel coincidence and a brutal emotional blow to the search teams who had hung their hope on that one shred of color in the mud. Just as morale dipped, the cadaver dogs were reintroduced. Trained animals from Oregon were brought in to rework previously covered ground. One of the dogs gave a strong alert near a marshy hollow northeast of the rest area, an area that had flooded the year before and still smelt faintly of decay. The signal triggered an immediate excavation order. Over the next 2 days, forensic anthropologists sifted through the soil with surgical precision. Small bones were recovered. Local media caught wind of the dig and began speculating. Some outlets ran premature headlines. "Remains possibly found," they wrote, repeating that phrase with slight variations. But then, the forensic results came back. The bones belonged to a deer. Not human. Not even close. The search had once again circled back to emptiness. Hopes that had been cautiously raised were flattened in a matter of hours. One of the dog handlers later admitted it was the first time in years he'd seen a false alert lead to such profound disappointment. As the investigation lost momentum, outside attention surged. True crime. Podcasts picked up the case. YouTube channels dissected the rest stop footage frame by frame, hunting for shadows, reflections, and inconsistencies. Online forums proposed maps, routes, escape theories, and one particularly persistent rumor, that a white panel van had been spotted in the area days before the disappearance. This matched an earlier unconfirmed report from a trucker, but no one could verify it. No license plate, no identifying marks, no time-stamped evidence. Still, the idea clung to the case like smoke. Soon, amateur sleuths were canvassing Idaho backroads, posting photos of white vans they saw parked in residential driveways or behind gas stations, flooding the local tip line with leads that never panned out. It was noise, endless, exhausting noise, that the investigators didn't have the bandwidth to process. Andrea watched it all unfold from Sarah's apartment. She had stopped sleeping through the night, spending her time sorting through Sarah's notebooks, old emails, Lucy's school papers, and anything that might provide a missing thread. Nothing did. But then, 16 days after the disappearance, a farmer in Bliss called the sheriff's office. He had found something strange on the western edge of his property, a child's backpack, propped up neatly against a fence post, untouched by rain or wind. The farmer hadn't touched it, just marked the location and waited. Deputies arrived within an hour. It was Lucy's. The backpack was pink with a purple butterfly decal stitched to the front. Inside were school supplies, a crumpled art project, a juice box, and a small sweater folded neatly inside. The contents were clean and undisturbed. No animal damage, no signs of water exposure. It looked as if someone had placed it there that morning. The location made no sense. It was 15 miles west of the rest stop, in a direction opposite where Sarah had been heading. There were no trails connecting it to any roads, no tire tracks near the site, and no footprints on the dry earth. Forensics later confirmed Lucy's fingerprints on several items and Sarah's DNA on the juice box straw. But there were no unknown prints, no foreign DNA. It was as if the backpack had been teleported there. The discovery ignited another round of search efforts. Helicopters returned to the skies. The property was scoured. Neighbors were questioned, but nothing else was found. No clothing, no blood, no electronics. Just that single pristine backpack placed almost as a message. To Andrea, it was worse than nothing. It meant someone still had Lucy, or had her for a time, and chose to leave behind a trace when they were ready. It was proof of movement, of contact, but not of outcome, and it reopened every wound that had just started to scar. For detectives, it shifted the case from a passive mystery to an active one again. The forest hadn't yielded a body, but it had shown one terrifying truth. Someone knew exactly what they were doing, and they still weren't done. By late October 2019, 4 months had passed since Sarah Whitaker and her daughter Lucy vanished from the Bliss Rest area. And despite the exhaustive manhunt, there was still no confirmed sighting, no meaningful forensic link, and no clear suspect. The early wave of urgency that had galvanized local law enforcement and pulled hundreds of volunteers into the field was starting to fade beneath a slow, suffocating weight of silence. The case, once front-page news, had become another haunting question buried beneath the headlines. Families in Idaho still locked their doors more tightly and still told their children to stay close, but the raw edge of public fear had dulled. The world had kept moving. But inside the Twin Falls Sheriff's Office, in a quiet room where the walls were covered in printouts, maps, and notes scribbled in red marker, investigators were still chasing the clock and losing. When the FBI formally joined the case in mid-October, it was partly procedural and partly a reflection of something harder to admit. The leads were drying up. They reviewed the initial interviews, revisited the forensic analysis, and took over digital data processing. Federal analysts re-examined Sarah's and Lucy's cell phone records, looking for patterns that had been missed. What they found added a disturbing new layer, but not the clarity anyone had hoped for. Both Sarah's and Lucy's phones had stopped transmitting data just under an hour after they arrived at the rest stop, around 8:38 p.m. That wasn't new, but what stood out was the final ping. Before going dark, Sarah's phone had connected briefly to a tower near a private road that forked off a dirt logging route just under 2 miles north of the rest area. The road wasn't publicly maintained. It didn't appear on Google Maps. It led through a patch of undeveloped land registered to a timber company headquartered out of state. The only structures visible on satellite imagery were 2 long-abandoned cabins and a shed near a runoff stream. Investigators hadn't included that patch in the original search radius. It had been deemed inaccessible. The discovery sent deputies back into the woods, now joined by federal agents and forensic techs. They combed the private road and surrounding brush, cataloging debris and scanning for anything: tire impressions, burnt refuse, disturbed ground. The cabins were dilapidated, tagged with graffiti, and filled with trash and broken furniture. One had signs of recent occupancy: cigarette butts, a rusted can opener, and a torn sleeping bag. But there was no evidence to link it to Sarah or Lucy. No DNA, no items out of place, nothing that made sense. When asked why her phone would ping in that area, experts speculated it could have been driven there briefly, even if only for a few minutes, before being shut off, the battery removed, or destroyed. It wasn't proof of an abduction, but it was a chilling hint that someone may have known exactly where to go to avoid cameras and detection. FBI profilers worked the psychological angle. If this was an abduction and not a voluntary disappearance, then it had likely been premeditated, not opportunistic, not random. The perpetrator had chosen a location with no camera coverage and a time of day when few witnesses would be around, and executed it without leaving traceable evidence behind. That suggested planning, familiarity with the area, and a level of control that made the odds of a second chance slim. Investigators interviewed every registered sex offender within a 50-mile radius. Background checks were run on every name in Sarah's contact list. And once again, Greg Whitaker was questioned. His answers didn't change, but his demeanor had grown colder, more rehearsed. He refused to provide DNA, citing legal protections. His attorney declined further cooperation. Without physical evidence or a clear connection to the pinged location, the FBI couldn't push further. As temperatures dropped in November, so did momentum. The mountains began to ice over. Snow dusted the forest floor, covering tracks, sealing the ground, and swallowing whatever fragments might have remained. Search operations were paused, public updates stopped, reporters moved on. The investigation entered a new phase, quiet, procedural, and mostly internal. Tips still trickled in, but none with the urgency or weight of the early weeks. People claimed to see Lucy in different states, in parking lots, in airports, and in fleeting glances at playgrounds. Each was chased down. None were real. Theories flourished online, some rooted in legitimate analysis, others veering into conspiracies involving interstate trafficking rings or rogue survivalist groups. Law enforcement stayed focused, but without new evidence, their hands were tied. Andrea refused to let it go cold. She emailed detectives weekly. She posted on forums, responded to tips herself, and held candlelight vigils outside Sarah's apartment building, trying to force the community to remember. She kept Lucy's bedroom untouched, the school books stacked on her desk, the glitter-covered shoes by the closet, and the nightlight shaped like a star still plugged in and glowing. Each night, she sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the empty space where Lucy's backpack had once been, now returned from evidence and resting quietly in the corner like a ghost no one wanted to speak about. To her, the silence wasn't just grief. It was complicity. A system losing steam because no one knew how to handle a case with no body, no trail, and no movement. Just absence. By December, snow blanketed the search area entirely. The forest was no longer accessible by foot. Helicopters couldn't penetrate the tree canopy, and drones were grounded due to wind conditions. The decision was made to suspend active search operations until spring thaw. The FBI maintained their involvement, but at a limited capacity. The case was no longer labeled urgent. It had become what investigators privately called a ghost file, one that lived in cold storage, waiting for a reason to come alive again. And for the first time since the night they vanished, there were no new calls, no new findings, and no one left searching in the woods. Just an open folder, a fading timeline, and a missing child whose name no longer echoed through the trees. But behind that silence, buried beneath the frost, someone still knew the truth, and they had kept it hidden through every mile, every season, and every closing door. In June of 2020, nearly a year after Sarah and Lucy vanished, the silence was broken by a single phone call placed from a gas station off Highway 12 in Walla Walla, Washington. The woman on the other end was in her late 40s, a traveling hospice nurse named Ruth Carlisle, who had pulled in for fuel and snacks during a late-night drive home from a patient visit. She told the dispatcher she wasn't the type to get involved in things like this, that she didn't even own a television, let alone keep up with true crime. But something about the girl she saw in the women's bathroom had unsettled her. The child had entered with a man in his 40s, of average build, wearing a green flannel shirt and jeans. He waited outside the stall while the girl, 7 or 8 she guessed, quietly washed her hands. What struck Ruth was how the girl kept glancing at the mirror, not at her own reflection, but toward the exit, like she was watching the door. When Ruth smiled and said hello, the child didn't answer. She looked up briefly, then away. And for a second, Ruth said, she felt like the girl wanted to say something but didn't. After they left, Ruth saw a faded missing poster on the gas station bulletin board with a picture of Lucy Whitaker. The resemblance hit her so hard she felt her hands shake. Within 24 hours, local police pulled the gas station's surveillance footage. The angles were limited, grainy and compressed, but they did capture a man holding the door for a small girl with dark hair and a pink hoodie. Facial recognition software was inconclusive. The child's face was only visible in profile, half obscured by the man's body. The timestamp matched Ruth's account. Law enforcement issued a regional BOLO, and the FBI was immediately notified. They reviewed traffic camera footage from surrounding intersections but found no match for the man's vehicle. It had either been out of frame or unregistered. The gas station didn't keep license plate logs. Still, the footage was enough to take the lead seriously. It was the first possible sighting of Lucy in nearly 12 months, and the first with any physical evidence to support it. Andrea was contacted immediately. She flew to Walla Walla with Sarah's old photo albums in her bag, ready to confirm or deny the UTE identity herself. When investigators showed her the footage, she stared at it in silence for over a minute. She said the girl's posture, the way she held her arms slightly bent, and the hesitant shuffle, it all looked like Lucy. But she couldn't be sure. The resolution was too low. It was like trying to remember a voice from a dream, familiar, but not whole. Andrea asked if she could speak to the woman who made the call. She thanked Ruth in person, hugged her tightly, told her she was the first person in over a year who made her believe Lucy might still be alive. The FBI issued a nationwide alert. News outlets picked up the story, now labeling it a possible recovery lead. Within a week, the agency released updated age progression images showing what Lucy might look like at 8 years old. Billboards were updated. The tip line, which had been nearly dormant, began lighting up with calls. A woman in Reno said she saw a girl with matching eyes at a rest stop 2 months earlier. A man in Tacoma swore he'd seen her walking into a pawn shop. A gas station clerk in Helena claimed she served the girl a slushie last winter, but only remembered her now after seeing the age-progressed photo. Each tip was investigated. None panned out. In nearly every case, the girl in question turned out to be someone else, a relative, a neighbor, a stranger passing through. And in each instance, the photo didn't match, the timeline didn't fit, or the details unraveled under scrutiny. As weeks passed, the momentum began to feel hollow. The man in the gas station footage was never identified. No one came forward to say they recognized him. No facial match in any known criminal or DMV database. No credit card used at the station matched any person of interest. It was as if he had slipped through, real, physical, captured, and still entirely unreachable. Andrea asked if the FBI would release a sketch. They said without a clearer image, it would risk flooding the tip line with false matches. The trail couldn't hold weight, not on its own. By September, the national coverage began to taper off. The story drifted down the news cycle, replaced by election updates, pandemic headlines, and other missing children whose timelines were more recent and their footage clearer. By Thanksgiving, the media had stopped calling. Andrea still checked the case thread on Reddit each morning. A few loyal followers still posted theories, speculating about the man, the car, and the possible states they could have traveled through. But even that chatter slowed. And by Christmas, the Walla Walla lead had joined the others in a growing file labeled inconclusive. For Andrea, it was another cruel repetition. Hope, magnified, inflated by news anchors and flashing headlines, then gradually deflated until it folded neatly back into grief. This sighting, more than any other, had felt real. The timing, the witness, the footage. She had allowed herself to picture Lucy's voice again, her laugh, her small hand wrapped in Sarah's. And now that image dissolved into static, replaced by the familiar ache of not knowing. The girl in the video might have been Lucy, or she might not have. But whoever she was, she walked into that bathroom, looked up at a stranger, and said nothing, and then vanished into another silence the investigation couldn't reach. In early spring of 2021, with snow finally melted and the ground soft enough to dig into again, a retired game warden named Frank Dillard quietly returned to the woods behind the Bliss Rest area. He hadn't been invited. He wasn't working under any agency. He had no official clearance. What he had was time, knowledge of terrain that most officers had only seen on printed maps, and a dog that had never failed him. Her name was Dixie, a 9-year-old scent-tracking bloodhound who had worked with him on dozens of missing person cases in Idaho and Montana before they both retired in 2019. Frank had followed the Whitaker case since it broke. He knew the area intimately. He had hunted elk here for decades, hiked through the logging trails, and helped search for lost hikers in those same woods. What bothered him wasn't what had been found. It was what hadn't. He believed something was still out there. So he loaded Dixie into his truck, brought a week's worth of supplies, and told no one but his wife where he was going. He started where the official search had ended, near the marsh where the cadaver dogs had false alerted, and then he moved northward, tracing the slope of the ridge that bordered the private timber road. It took him 3 days to find what he didn't know he was looking for. Dixie began to signal near a rotting structure half swallowed by undergrowth, an old tool shed, its roof partially collapsed, tucked between a dry creek bed and a thicket of pine. Frank recognized it. Years earlier, it had belonged to a seasonal trapping lease, abandoned sometime in the mid-2000s when the land changed hands. The site hadn't been included in any of the original search grids. On paper, it looked insignificant. But to Frank, it made perfect sense. Remote, forgotten, just far enough outside the mapped area to be missed by drones and heat scanners. Dixie circled the backside of the shed and pawed at a patch of loose soil near a sun-bleached log. Frank marked the coordinates and began a shallow dig using hand tools. 4 inches down, something bright caught his eye, a faded scrap of synthetic pink, pinched between roots and heavy clay. He stopped immediately. What he uncovered was part of a child's jacket, torn but unmistakably familiar. It was the same shade and the same material Andrea had described to investigators in 2019 when she submitted a photo of Lucy wearing it. Frank took photographs, reburied the site, and contacted the FBI that night from a motel room in Twin Falls. He didn't trust the tip line. He wanted a real person, real eyes on it, before anyone dismissed it as another false trail. The FBI responded within 12 hours. A forensics team arrived the next morning with cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar. They cordoned off a 100-foot perimeter around the collapsed shed and began a controlled excavation. Soil samples were collected. Luminol was used to test for biological fluids. No bones were recovered. No human remains, no teeth, no tools. But what they did confirm was enough to change everything. The fabric fragment was matched to Lucy Whitaker's jacket through fiber analysis, and a trace amount of mitochondrial DNA, preserved just enough to verify maternal relation to Sarah. It was the first piece of physical evidence found since Lucy's backpack the year before. It placed her there, not possibly, not speculatively, but definitively. For investigators, the find reopened what had quietly become a cold case. Active resources were reallocated. Teams were brought back in from Boise and Spokane. Interviews were repeated. Property ownership records around the shed were reviewed and old timber contracts traced. The land had passed through several hands, with one limited liability company appearing repeatedly, a shell corporation tied to a defunct outfitter service based out of Missoula. The FBI began cross-referencing old employees and field staff who had worked near Bliss between 2017 and 2020. One name surfaced twice. Someone flagged in a prior missing persons case out of Yakima in 2016, later cleared due to lack of evidence. That individual's last known address was in northern Nevada, but the trail had gone cold. Andrea was notified personally by the lead FBI agent. They didn't want her hearing it from the media. When she was shown the photos of the fabric fragment, she didn't cry. She just nodded. She said she already knew Lucy had been in those woods. She'd felt it for nearly 2 years. Now, someone was finally listening. The shed became a central point of the new investigation. Forensic botanists examined pollen residue. Archaeologists were brought in to examine the soil layers for signs of tampering or previous excavation. Still, no bodies, no tools, no fingerprints. The theory shifted. Maybe Lucy had been kept alive there for a time, or maybe the jacket was left deliberately, a breadcrumb placed later to confuse the timeline. Either possibility opened doors the FBI wasn't yet ready to speak about publicly. The news broke nationally within 48 hours. The headlines read, "New evidence found in Whitaker disappearance," and "Jacket fragment may place missing girl at abandoned Idaho shed." Tips began coming in again, but this time with a tone of urgency the case hadn't seen since the gas station sighting. Online forums reignited. Andrea held a press conference flanked by local officials. She said one sentence that stuck with people. She was there, and someone still knows what happened after that. And while the property became a focal point of renewed interest, no one could answer the one question that now loomed larger than ever. If Lucy's jacket made it there, why hadn't she? Just weeks after the FBI confirmed the pink fabric found behind the collapsed shed belonged to Lucy Whitaker, the investigation took a sharp turn toward a name that had never once appeared in the original case files. His name was Owen Carver. He didn't show up on local sex offender registries. He wasn't related to Sarah, Greg, or any known associate. But a background sweep of land usage around the rest stop led agents to discover that Carver had been living off-grid for nearly 7 years in a makeshift cabin along the riverbank, just under 2 miles from where Sarah and Lucy were last seen. On paper, he didn't exist. No utility bills, no vehicle registration, no tax records. Just a scattered digital trace from nearly a decade earlier, a janitorial position at a high school in Butte County, an eviction, a sealed misdemeanor arrest in 2006, and then nothing. It was as if he'd simply removed himself from the map. Until now, no one had linked him to the disappearance. Owen's name surfaced after agents traced ownership of several rusted tools found near the abandoned shed. Some had serial numbers, others had faded manufacturer stamps. They weren't recent purchases. They were old, worn down by use and exposure. But one shovel bore a distinct engraving, half scratched off, that matched a brand only distributed through a specific Montana hardware chain that had closed its Idaho location in 2015. Through sales records, the FBI identified a short list of local buyers from that year. Owen was one of them. His purchase had been logged under a prepaid debit card and matched to a P.O. box near Hagerman that was never renewed. When agents searched archived building permits, they found a report of an unauthorized structure on forest land, issued but never enforced. Coordinates aligned almost perfectly with a known fire scar from the 2020 Boole wildfire, a blaze that had destroyed several unregistered cabins and outbuildings in the area. The location sat along a narrow bend in the Snake River, and at the time, no one had searched it in connection to Sarah and Lucy. Investigators contacted the Bureau of Land Management, requesting satellite imagery and burn data from that stretch of forest. What they found confirmed the structure had once existed. More importantly, it confirmed that someone had lived there during the time of the disappearance. A drone-captured image from July 2019 showed smoke rising from a crude chimney pipe. But by the time the fire reached the site in September 2020, the cabin had already been empty. There was no sign of human remains, no calls were placed for help, no name was filed among displaced fire victims. Owen Carver had vanished before the flames ever reached him. Locals were asked if they remembered him. A few did. A woman who ran a Badita bait shack near the river said she remembered a man who came in once a month for canned goods and propane. He didn't talk much, always paid in cash, dirty clothes, long beard, hollow eyes. She remembered he had a rusted green canoe that he used to haul supplies upriver, but she hadn't seen him since sometime in late 2019. She'd assumed he died in the fire. When she was shown an old photo of Owen from a DMV record dated 2008, she nodded without hesitation. Then she paused. Quietly, she told the agent that in late June of 2019, just a couple of weeks after the rest stop incident, she saw him canoeing upriver, and that time, he wasn't alone. He had a child with him. She couldn't be sure it was Lucy. The child wore a hooded sweatshirt, sat hunched low in the boat, and never spoke. But the proportions, she said, small frame, light hair, matched the photos she saw later in the news. At the time, she didn't connect it. She assumed the child was his granddaughter. She didn't even know there had been a disappearance until months later. By then, the search had narrowed, and she never thought to report it. Now, hearing that they found part of Lucy's jacket near the area where Owen lived, she came forward. The witness was credible. She had no record, no motive to lie, and her timeline matched independently verified images from the BLM, showing the canoe docked at the bend on the same week she claimed to have seen them. It was enough to relaunch the FBI's focus. The surrounding forest was re-examined. Dive teams were sent to probe the depths of the river. Divers recovered remnants of a collapsed dock, a propane tank, and a rusted coffee can filled with burnt papers. But no journals, no weapons, no human remains. Nothing directly tied to Lucy or Sarah beyond location and timing. Still, for agents, it was the most plausible narrative they had had in 2 years. Owen Carver, a man with no formal address, no current employment, and no legal obligations, was now considered a person of extreme interest. But he had disappeared long before authorities could reach him. His name didn't show up in border logs, credit records, or federal databases. Whether he fled intentionally or became another casualty of the wilderness was unclear. But the witness who saw him with the child couldn't be dismissed. She remembered the way he held the paddle, protective but jittery, and how he kept glancing at the tree line as if afraid someone was following. And what she said next haunted investigators more than anything else. "It didn't look like they were going fishing," she said. "It looked like they were leaving for good." In May of 2024, 5 years after Sarah and Lucy Whitaker vanished without a sound, a man named Brad Monroe launched his aluminium boat just before sunrise from a boat ramp near the Hagerman stretch of the Snake River. It was trout season, and for Brad, a retired postal worker who fished alone most mornings, it was more ritual than sport. The runoff had been unusually heavy that spring, fed by rapid snowmelt in the Sawtooth foothills. Currents were fast and unpredictable, and the water was higher than it had been in nearly a decade. Trees from upstream had broken loose and jammed together near a bend he hadn't fished in years, a spot where the river pinched sharply against a wall of brush and half-submerged branches. That morning, as he cast just beyond the log jam, his lure caught on something. He assumed it was driftwood, but when he tugged, it didn't give, not like wood. It was solid, boxy, and resistant, metal. He pulled harder. It took him almost 20 minutes to drag it loose from the tangle, and when he finally did, it scraped to the surface in patches of rust and blackened algae. A rectangular crate, heavy, sealed at one point, now fractured on one side. At first, he thought it was scrap from a construction site. Then, as the crate rocked in his boat, the edge of the tarp peeled open, and everything changed. Brad didn't touch it again. He called the sheriff from his boat with shaking hands, then drifted to shore and waited. By the time investigators arrived, the crate had begun to leak through the opening, a slow trickle of river water tinted with something darker. What they found inside was exactly what they feared. 2 partial skeletons compressed and bound tightly in overlapping layers of plastic tarp, secured at the corners with old nylon rope and partially weighed down with flat river stones. The remains were fragile, warped from prolonged exposure to moisture and time. Forensic specialists were called in immediately. The area was locked down. A dive team scoured the surrounding bend, and it was there, half buried in the sediment about 30 feet downstream, that they found something else. A melted plastic ID badge, blackened at the edges but still legible. The name on it was Owen Carver. The discovery ignited a firestorm. News outlets broke the story within 24 hours. "Bodies found in Snake River may solve 5-year mystery," the headlines read. The Whitaker case, which had slowly faded from national attention, was now back in full focus. Forensic teams worked quickly. Dental records confirmed the smaller set of remains belonged to Lucy. The larger remains were confirmed as Sarah's days later. The FBI held a press conference shortly after, calling it both a breakthrough and a tragedy. But they stopped short of declaring the case closed. What remained unclear was how, and exactly when, the crate had entered the river. Analysis showed the bones had been submerged for years, likely at least 3. Decomposition was consistent with extended water exposure, but the level of preservation suggested they hadn't been in open current the entire time. The crate itself showed signs of abrasion and impact. Most likely, it had been lodged somewhere upstream, buried beneath silt or brush until the spring. Runoff dislodged it and sent it tumbling downriver. A path was traced back through several tributaries, including a narrow runoff channel that passed near the burnt cabin site where Owen Carver had once lived. Investigators now believed the crate had likely been concealed near the base of the slope above the Snake River floodplain, buried, hidden in the brush, or covered by debris from the wildfire. And when winter runoff reached its peak, it had finally broken loose. Inside the crate, no clothing remained intact, only rusted zippers, degraded thread, and a few buttons. One of the tarp layers had melted to the bone in places, creating difficulty during extraction. But no bullets were found, no sharp force trauma. Both skulls were intact. There were no fractures indicating blunt force impact. Toxicology was inconclusive due to decomposition. The cause of death, officially, was listed as undetermined, but investigators strongly believed it had been suffocation or poisoning. Quiet, quick, without trace. The ID badge recovered nearby was partially fused, indicating it had been exposed to fire at some point, almost certainly during the Boole wildfire that consumed Carver's cabin in 2020. The timing aligned. Investigators now theorized that Carver had stored the bodies in the crate long before the fire, possibly in a dugout near the riverbank or beneath his cabin floor. When the fire swept through, he either fled or died elsewhere, but the crate remained hidden until nature brought it back up. Search efforts for Carver's remains were immediately renewed. Dogs were brought in. Drones rescanned the fire scar, but no other human remains were found. If he died in the fire, his bones were likely destroyed. If he fled, he has left no trace since. But what they had now was a complete chain of connection. The jacket fragment is behind the shed. The unconfirmed sighting at the river, the melted badge, and the crate. For the FBI, the pieces were no longer theoretical. The man who had lived less than 2 miles from where a mother and daughter vanished was almost certainly responsible. The evidence couldn't prove intent, but it proved contact. And that, after 5 years, was enough to bring the case to its final devastating truth. Andrea was notified privately before the news broke. She didn't speak publicly for several weeks. When she did, it was only to confirm one thing. Sarah and Lucy had not simply disappeared. They had been hidden, erased, and buried by a man who had learned how to survive by vanishing himself. But in the end, it was the river, not the system, that gave them back. For 5 years, the question wasn't just what happened to Sarah and Lucy Whitaker. It was how 2 people could vanish from a rest stop in the space of a few minutes without anyone seeing or hearing a thing. But after the rusted crate surfaced from the Snake River in 2024, investigators finally had the evidence to reconstruct the timeline. They'd been chasing since day one. The last 5 years of theories, sightings, false leads, and speculation all collapsed under the weight of forensic truth. The crate had held not only the remains of a mother and daughter, it had also held a narrative buried in trauma and silence, one that would take weeks of analysis and testing to fully understand. But in the end, it was the science that drew the lines between the moments and the evidence that filled in the blank space between their disappearance and discovery. And what emerged was a story far more horrifying in its simplicity than anyone had imagined. Investigators now believe that Owen Carver had been living in the woods near the Bliss Rest area for at least 2 years before Sarah and Lucy arrived that June night in 2019. His cabin, a makeshift structure built from salvaged lumber and covered in camouflage tarp, had been hidden in a thicket less than 1.8 miles from the rest stop. Satellite imagery from that time period, once dismissed as inconclusive, was re-examined and confirmed faint heat signatures near the tree line on multiple occasions, including the night of the disappearance. Carver had no vehicle, no electricity, no known associates, but he had isolation, time, and, according to behavioral analysts, a deliberate pattern of watching without being seen. When investigators walked the terrain with the newly confirmed timeline in hand, it became disturbingly clear. From the vantage point of Carver's position in the woods, the rest stop was fully visible, especially at dusk. The ambush was likely fast. There were no signs of a struggle at the vehicle, which meant he probably waited until they were walking back, tired, distracted, arms full. Investigators believe Carver followed them from the bathroom structure, moving low through the trees parallel to the gravel. There was a narrow blind spot between the vending machines and the car, a space the cameras didn't quite catch. He struck there. A footprint discovered years later beneath the vegetation behind the rest stop, overlooked in the original sweep, was matched to a vintage work boot, the same kind recovered near Carver's former camp. It was enough to confirm proximity, enough to know he had been close. Sarah's remains told the rest. Forensic anthropologists identified several broken phalanges in her right hand, as well as bite marks on her forearm, consistent with defensive wounds. Skin cells lodged under her fingernails were finally matched in 2024 to Owen Carver's DNA. That confirmation came after years of waiting for sufficient degradation markers to isolate his sequence. There was no longer room for speculation. Sarah had fought hard, but she lost. Lucy's bones showed no defensive injuries. That, to investigators, suggested she hadn't been harmed in the initial struggle. Instead, they believe Carver kept her alive for at least several days. A behavioral profile developed by the FBI suggested a scenario in which Lucy was isolated, moved, and controlled, likely kept in Carver's underground crawl space, a space later destroyed by wildfire. This theory is supported by a 2021 search team's discovery of children's toy fragments, a juice box straw, and a degraded blanket found near the remains of Carver's cabin foundation, items never tied to him previously. The objects were tested again following the crate's recovery. DNA on the straw matched Lucy. The blanket fibers matched the same pattern from her missing backpack. The timeline now placed her alive for at least 3 to 5 days after Sarah's death, and possibly longer. When the 2020 wildfire swept through the area, it reached Carver's property in a matter of hours. The blaze destroyed his shelter, his storage area, and any remaining trace of his movements. Nobody was ever found, but investigators now believe Carver escaped on foot and never returned. Whether he died elsewhere or continued hiding is unknown, but they now theorize that after the fire, runoff and erosion exposed the buried crate, once sealed beneath layers of brush and soil, and over time, spring floods loosened it, pushing it downstream until it surfaced in 2024. The ID badge, scorched but intact, confirmed the proximity. The DNA under Sarah's nails confirmed the attacker, and the binding method of the crate, along with the specific knot patterns, matched rope work found in Carver's old janitorial records that included incident reports from 2005, where he'd once restrained a student during a physical altercation. That incident had led to his quiet resignation, and ultimately, the sealed record. With every forensic result pointing to Owen Carver, the case was declared officially closed. No further suspects, no outstanding charges, just a posthumous designation, offender deceased, case resolved by evidence. But for Andrea, closure was the wrong word. It wasn't closure. It was confirmation of what she already believed the night her sister didn't call. The kind of truth that doesn't comfort but simply removes the last shred of denial. In the final FBI briefing, she asked just one question: why them? And the answer never came. Because sometimes the monster isn't a stranger on a list or a man with a motive. Sometimes it's just a silent watcher in the trees, waiting for a mother and daughter to park, stretch, and walk away from a car they never got back to.